My dear friends, this is Daisuke, and I very much hope that this video finds you well and in very good spirits wherever you are in the world. And today, if you don't mind, I would very much like to continue on with our journey, our discussions, and our explorations with respect to those films that can be found within this very extraordinary set of works, which has been given the title of Pioneers of African American Cinema, which has been curated by Jacqueline Stewart and Charles Musser. This happens to be the Kino Classics Blu-ray release set, and there are a number of discs that are found within this particular Blu-ray set. We have been discussing throughout the course of a number of months on this channel each of the films that are contained within this great set. And that brings us today to a film that can be found on the 4th Blu-ray disc. To be even more specific, it is the first film that is found on such 4th disc. This is a film which is described as being a sound film from 1932, and it is from the extraordinary filmmaker artist Oscar Micheaux. And the name of the work is The Girl from Chicago. This is a very interesting film that can be described as being maybe a romance drama, as well as an action film, as well as a mystery film, a type of murder mystery film, or with legal intrigue and a type of whodunit structure that is also based upon a very intriguing two-part plot structure or subplot structure, and I'll get to that momentarily. So there is a lot here that is very interesting and worth considering, not just as a film itself and what the film itself provides in terms of its entertainment value, but also in the context of Oscar Micheaux's filmography, as we have seen it expressed, say, in sets like this. And as we know, this set is so great for a number of reasons, but one of those reasons is that it showcases the work of so many great filmmaker artists, including Oscar Micheaux. In fact, we had a number of films by him on other discs, and we will talk about more films from Oscar Micheaux as we proceed with the discussions of the films on the 4th disc right now, the first of which being this one, The Girl from Chicago. I think if we were to try to break down the plot essence of the film, we could focus on the main character, our hero, who is Alonzo White. And he is described as being an agent of what's described as the United States Secret Service. And through certain machinations of plot and circumstance, he finds himself in this locale or place, which is Batesburg, Mississippi. And through this particular set of circumstances as well, he meets, for instance, other characters like the character of Norma, the young woman with whom he has a type of attraction, and we understand too that the attraction is most likely mutual, thus creating a subplot of a romance element between those two characters, which drives those characterizations along towards a certain conclusion that leads into the second half of the film. So Norma, there's also the character of Mary, there's also the character of Liza, and how those two characters, and others, but perhaps those two characters, have certain events or certain places within the narrative in this early part that have ramifications that we see play themselves out in the second part of the film as well, which takes place in Harlem, New York, or associated with events that take place in New York. And then, of course, there's the character of Jeff Ballinger, who is perhaps portrayed here as a type of antagonist, because we understand, too, that there is a plot or an undercurrent of some kind of criminal activity or possible criminal activity involving, on the one hand, Jeff Ballinger and his ability to, or his control over this community by means of what's known as peonage, or often described as being a type of slavery that is premised upon the debts that are owed to a particular, let's say, to debts that are owed, and in order to pay back such debt, or in acknowledgement of the debt position, there is a type of peonage situation that occurs. And this is one of the criminal elements against which Alonzo White, again our hero, is asked to enter and somehow deal with such situation. The other somewhat maybe dark element, or the somewhat criminal element that can be associated here as well, is the notion of Jeff Ballinger and his control or grip on the community, and how he exploits that in order to, in essence, exploit relationships with the women who arrive in this particular community, including Norma. And so therein lies another area in which Alonzo White must serve as the defender of justice, not just in terms of the debt peonage aspect, but also in terms of protecting Norma and others from similar sorts of fates. And so this is the double-pronged antagonism from the so-called villain, or one of the villains of the piece. And this is, again, up to Alonzo to essentially thwart those plans and save the day. It is much more complicated than that as well, because we have the introduction of other characters, other associates of Jeff Ballinger, other associates of Norma and Mary, etc., and how they figure in. In particular, there's the character of Liza, and she has a very strong significance as well. And we have echoes or follow-ups or overlaps that go into the second part of the film, which takes place primarily around or associated with New York, or Harlem, New York. And there is a nightclub scene. There is a sort of a jazz singing section, as well as singing and dancing. And Alonzo and Norma and Mary are part of these proceedings. But also there are other characters as well, including the character of Gomez. And here in the second half, we have the story that involves the numbers racket and gambling, and how we see the roots of these gambling influences have a negative impact on characters like Mary, but how those associations lead through certain plot developments to a very serious situation involving death and murder of a particular character, and the possibility of someone taking the blame for such murder, but that person wasn't responsible. Maybe there was someone else responsible for such murder. And so it is up once again to the character, our hero, Alonzo White, to prevent this miscarriage of justice and save the day by trying to locate and find and identify and capture the person that is ultimately responsible for this particular death or murder that takes place in the second half. So there is a lot packed within this film in terms of the sort of battling against certain criminal elements that are displayed in both of these locations that are involved. There is a type of duality or dichotomy that is set up by the very plot structure itself, because we have two sources or two locations. So primarily, in a sense, it's like two stories combined into one film, with overlap of various characters that we see in one part then appear in the other part through a certain set of circumstances. And so in this way and others, and also I should say too that introduced throughout are some musical interlude numbers. Sometimes we see, especially in the first part, musical interludes involving singing at the piano and playing at the piano. And then in the second part, where we're dealing with the Harlem, New York nightclub scene, we have song and dance numbers. And some of them might be said to be maybe musical interludes, but in fact others can be said also to be very integral to the various subplots that we see play themselves out throughout each of these component parts that combine to form the ultimate whole, which is the film The Girl from Chicago. So there is a lot here. There is a lot here, and it's wonderful that it is included here in this wonderful presentation as part of this set. Now, taking a step back, I think we should keep in mind, of course, that this is a work, again, from the early 1930s, from this extraordinary artist, Oscar Micheaux. And I must emphasize, again, how extraordinary Oscar Micheaux as an artist is. He had so many interests, and he was a writer and also a filmmaker, and he had a very powerful body of work, especially in the silent period leading up to, of course, this period of 1932. And so there are a number of themes and a number of concerns that are associated with Oscar Micheaux's body of work in filmography that I think can also be said to be associated or embedded or somehow or another connected with the film presentation that is The Girl from Chicago. When we think about The Girl from Chicago, though, I think one of the critiques that might be made could be the fact that, or could be the idea or the notion or the perception that this film might be seen to be, by some anyway, to be somewhat maybe stagey or static. Maybe some of the setups might seem a little bit non-engaging in terms of the somewhat maybe how one can describe it. Maybe it might not seem as effective in terms of the setup and the way the characters are presented and the performances, etc., how the dialogue is presented. Maybe there could be some room for critique or criticism as to the filmmaking style that is employed. In particular, this might be said to be applicable not just to this particular film, but other films perhaps in the works of, or the body of Oscar Micheaux's films, specifically the sound film period. And if you feel that way when you watch The Girl from Chicago, if you feel that there's a sense of maybe, quote-unquote, a type of maybe amateurishness in the way that certain scenes are set up, I think that's a very fair and reasonable criticism to make. And if you feel that way, that is, I think, very legitimate. However, one also might keep in mind, too, the idea or the notion that, or a number of things. First of all, we have Oscar Micheaux, who's making this film, and a lot of information can be found, for instance, in this great booklet that's part of this set, and the essays here. For example, the essay written by Charles Musser called Race, Cinema, and the Color Line. And so we understand that Oscar Micheaux was a fiercely independent filmmaker. I mean, he was fiercely independent, and his drive and his motivation was one of the great strengths and assets of his filmmaking brand, as it were. And so that means that perhaps there weren't all the necessary, technological advances at his disposal because of, say, certain limitations in budget and production value. So that is one thing to keep in mind. Those, say, limitations aside, I think we still get in the film like The Girl from Chicago a lot of the great thematic concern that is prevalent throughout the body of work of Oscar Micheaux that we know of. For example, I mentioned the dichotomy, or the split, if you will, or the subcomponent plot structure. The first story taking place primarily in and around Batesburg, and the second story taking place primarily in and around Harlem. And so we have here this divide, or this subgrouping between the story that's taking place in the South and the story that's taking place in the North. Also, it could be said, too, further delineated on other parallel means, such that the first story is taking place maybe in a rural or a small community type of setting, whereas the second story is taking place in the city or the urban setting. And we have seen in past films how Oscar Micheaux deals with the various circumstances or environments, the rural versus the urban setting, especially in the context of, say, the homesteader life in other films. Here we don't get necessarily any direct reference to homesteader life, I grant you that. However, my point is that we do get this sense of a divide, or not a divide necessarily, but different treatments of, say, story attention in the context of the rural environment versus the context of the urban environment. That's one way. Also, the context of the South and the context of the North. And what's interesting is I mentioned the word divide, but now I want to say that I hesitate using that word divide, because the word divide would suggest a tension or a complete difference between the two. But in fact, what's so fascinating here about this division, shall we say, is that in fact even the story overlaps indicate to me that perhaps there is more similarity between how things are working in this rural environment and how things are working in this urban environment, at least as portrayed in the film The Girl from Chicago. And there is much similarity in terms of how things are portrayed in the South, the Southern story, and how things are portrayed in the Northern story. And I think this subtle approach to, say, different parts of the country still suggest a similarity, which I think is very much consistent with the kind of complexity that Oscar Micheaux always brings to the various thematic discussions that we have seen in past films and indeed echoed in a film like The Girl from Chicago. So that's one thing to keep in mind. Also, Charles Musser, in the essay that I cited earlier, which is found in the book called Race, Cinema, and the Color Line, does speak a little bit about this film on page 27 of the book. And for example, in the first whole paragraph that's found on such page, about 6 lines in, Charles Musser writes, "The film locates criminal behavior in both the South and the North, among whites and blacks alike. Jeff Ballinger, the son of a wealthy white planter, does as he pleases in the small southern town of Batesburg, Mississippi, including the regular seduction of black women who come to the town. His plans to prey on Norma Shepard are interrupted by the appearance of Alonzo White, an agent for the U.S. Secret Service. This African-American government employee arrests Ballinger for peonage. Later, Alonzo solves a Harlem murder mystery involving numbers banker Maximo Gomez. Criminality operates on both sides of the color line. Both Ballinger and Gomez treat their local black community as a personal playground to exploit however they might wish." And it goes on to say, and also I should say here, let me skip down to another line here. "It is also perhaps significant that the film's African-American hero has the last name of White." And there ends Charles Musser's paragraph on this film. This brings up, or Professor Musser brings up a number of very intriguing and very significant points about the treatment of race as we see it here in The Girl from Chicago. So if we first see the character of Jeff Ballinger, who is described as being here the son of a wealthy white planter, and also Charles Musser describes Ballinger and Gomez being the character from the New York story, treating their local black community as a personal playground to exploit however they might wish. And so here we have the elements of criminality and how that is set up in the context of this particular story or stories that also has the element of race and is involved. So this is, I think, a very interesting way that maybe Oscar Micheaux could be said to be, in the words of Charles Musser, blurring what is known, or what he refers to, Professor Musser refers to as race, cinema, and the color line, and perhaps blurring it or calling attention to it, or maybe somehow maybe satirizing it, or other type of thematic treatment within the context of the cinema voice of Micheaux, such to draw attention to it in a very intriguing way. Also, of course, we have the idea of that's set forth in the very opening credits of the film, The Girl from Chicago, and the cast listing, an all-colored cast. And so this is another strong indication of one of the sort of designs or concerns of the film as a type of story that's taking place within the context of these specified and described communities, the Batesburg story and then the Harlem story, but within that we have the intertwining of the storylines of intrigue and mystery and action, and the the defending of justice, as it were, with a character who is named Alonzo White, as Charles Musser, I think, very astutely points out as well. So there is a lot of sort of complexity that is at least hinted at within the context of The Girl from Chicago. Now, at the same time, too, one should acknowledge that maybe there's maybe that complexity is nuanced, and maybe it is there as a secondary level, with the primary level being the entertaining value or the objective of entertaining the audiences with this romance story and this action adventure story, this murder mystery story that's portrayed here in The Girl from Chicago. So however you view it, or whatever your perception is of the film, I think ultimately there is still that strong connection with Oscar Micheaux and his handling of issues and themes regarding race and race relations that we have seen in past films, that we will see in other films, and that we do, I think, quite convincingly and quite undeniably see treated as we do in this film, The Girl from Chicago. So this therefore makes The Girl from Chicago a very key and related film, and very relevant in the context of the filmmaking or filmography body of work of Oscar Micheaux overall, or writ large. I should say, too, as a closer of this discussion, I should say, too, that I also recognize that there is maybe a sense of a spirit of, I don't want to say experimentation, but also there's a sense of, here we are in the sound era of cinema. And it seems, too, that maybe ultimately when we think of the film, we might think of the film as a piece of entertainment that has this story of intrigue and the heroes and the villains, and interspersed throughout we have these musical numbers. And so maybe there is also a sense of experimentation and trying to forge his cinematic identity, Oscar Micheaux's cinematic identity, in this new era of sound films, which is why maybe there's this emphasis on singing and dancing, or the musical numbers and the piano, or in the night hall or the nightclub, etc. And so that might be part of it too, that this is also a showcase, if you will, of the dawn of the sound era from a certain point of view. So I think maybe, and that is also in the context of Oscar Micheaux's independent filmmaking spirit, which is also on display. And so I really want to emphasize, as a type of closer to this conversation, how this film is an independent film. It is a film from a very extraordinary filmmaker, artist, Oscar Micheaux, who has this large body of work that is very important, very critical. And this film, The Girl from Chicago, however one looks at it, as a type of entertainment that might fail, that might succeed or might fail on certain maybe production level values, but still, no matter how one looks at it, still also ultimately is very strongly linked in terms of the way in which it treats, either directly or on a nuanced subtextual level, how it treats themes of race and race relations that we have seen treated in past Oscar Micheaux films, as well as the idea of environment, north and south, rural and urban, and the idea of the story that is placed within these various contexts, or the stories, I should say, that are placed within these various contexts, and what the ultimate end results are. And those end results are revealed as we get to the final close of the film, and the film ends, and we have The Girl from Chicago. So there is, I would suggest, a lot here. It might not be a film for everyone, that is for sure, and I do acknowledge that. But it is one that is, again, another very important point in the career of Oscar Micheaux, and we will see other films that may be said to be following a similar line of style and treatment. And so this could be said to be another grouping or era or sub-era within the context of the filmography of Micheaux. And in that way, I think it's a very exciting film to watch indeed. This is the film The Girl from Chicago. Okay, my friends, so that's it for now. And so until we meet again, please be happy and healthy and well, and please keep on watching a lot of great, great movies. Thank you so much, as always, for your time. I very, very much appreciate it. Stay strong, stay safe, and cheers.